All right, good afternoon everyone and welcome to the Beaconstac webinar. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I want to thank people who are dialing into this webinar from all over the world. I know we have attendees from Australia, from Denmark, from India, and of course the US. So thank you for your time, and over the next 30 minutes I hope to cover some of the knowledge that we ourselves have gathered about deploying beacons in the real world. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on some of the basics of beacons, what they are, how you can use them, and how they actually work with a smartphone, and then get to the real challenges of deploying beacons in a given physical space. We're going to have questions, of course, throughout the session, but what I'd like to request you to do is type in your questions in the question window. We'll collect them and answer them all at the end. In the event that I'm not able to answer all questions in today's session, I will post a separate blog post with the answers to your questions from today. So please feel free to type in whatever comes to your mind. We'd be happy to share our experiences over the course of today's webinar. So deploying beacons in the real world. Clearly, if you've dialed into this webinar, you care about beacons and you really think that they can make a difference to your business. So what are beacons exactly? Beacons are low-cost, low-power radio transmitters, really, and they are radio transmitters equipped with what are known as Bluetooth low-energy transmitters. They're also called Bluetooth 4.0 or Bluetooth Smart. Now, beacons typically tend to be of all shapes and sizes, but most of the time they serve a specific purpose of transmitting a signal and using that signal to detect proximity of a user through their smartphone or tablet. And essentially they help in determining microlocation, which is location not at a GPS level, that is not latitude or longitude, but location inside a building, perhaps within a floor, or even inside a room. That's what beacons are really good for, and that's why they're getting attention across the world, and people and businesses are beginning to deploy beacons for their different use cases. How beacons work is something that comes up often when we talk to our clients and when we have people working with beacons for the first time. So I want to take a minute to explain how beacons actually work. Hopefully I won't go into too much technical detail. I don't want to bore any of you, but fundamentally a beacon transmits a radio signal. Now, this signal travels through just the regular space and is received by another device. Essentially, this signal allows the other device that receives the signal to determine its proximity or distance to the beacon that was transmitting the signal. Now, in most cases, this other device is a smartphone. In many cases, it's a tablet. It can also be any other device that knows how to receive the signal and speak the Bluetooth low energy protocol. Now, this received signal strength, as it's known, is used by the smartphone or tablet device to determine how far it really is or how close it really is. Now, it can determine, for instance, that it's very close or near the beacon or far from the beacon, and these zones are typically defined in terms of distance ranges. So between 8 and 10 meters, or less than 0.5 meters, or between 2 and 8 meters. So it helps you get a broad sense of your distance to a given beacon. Now, beacons don't actually transmit any data or content themselves, and this is something which is really fundamental. I've seen in numerous conversations that some people tend to be a little confused about whether beacons can actually do this. But standard beacons that you can buy from most manufacturers will transmit essentially a couple of numbers, and those numbers are known as major, minor numbers, and UDID numbers. So this signal contains only those numbers, and the smartphone or tablet uses this data that's coming in along with the received signal strength to identify the beacon and to determine its distance. Now, there have been many applications before beacons that have tried to determine location at a micro level using other technologies. Wi-Fi has been used in numerous cases for determining your position within a building using what is known as Wi-Fi triangulation. And what's interesting is that beacons really augment what you can do with indoor location or micro location using Wi-Fi. So beacons and Wi-Fi can work well together if you choose to use both. They can also work separately. You don't have to use them together, but if you do choose to do it, you can get information from Wi-Fi as well as beacons and merge those in determining the right behavior inside your app, depending on whether you have wayfinding or navigation or any of those use cases. You may end up finding that it's actually a good idea to use both Wi-Fi and beacons or just one, as the case may be. So that's how really beacons work. And moving on to really why use beacons at all? I mean, what is it that businesses are doing with beacons? In our experience, having worked with clients in different industries, we're seeing that whether they are in retail or in hospitality or the hotel industry, whether they're in events or even in theme parks or airports, there are all kinds of different use cases that beacons are being put to. But fundamentally, beacons are being leveraged in three essential ways. That's the way we like to think of it. They're being used to create awareness, so essentially engage with customers, help them learn information that they may not have already or they may find difficult to get access to. Improve the customer experience, which is to help businesses deliver a better service or provide information that would enhance the customer experience of the brand or the business. And of course, work with engage users, in some cases get feedback and do things like that. Now, there's something that I want to share with you guys, because this is the way we like to think of beacons, right? We like to think of beacons as virtual assistants. They're essentially like people, except that they're invisible, and just as a person who's who's an usher or who's in a store meant for your assistance, who would come and greet you and ask you what you need and guide you along, beacons are really just in many ways similar to those kinds of people, except that they're invisible, so they're kind of hidden away, and they're very unobtrusive. They're not necessarily engaging directly, but they're using the consumer smartphone to engage. So they send a message through the smartphone app or offer assistance. You can use beacons to gather feedback. You can use beacons to just provide some information that the consumer may find useful. So we really like to think of beacons as virtual assistants, and this has applications obviously in all kinds of businesses. So I just mentioned that a beacon engages with a smartphone or engages with a user's device, smartphone or tablet. But there's something which is really important for all of us to be clear about before we move any further, right? And understanding how to use beacons. You absolutely need an app to do anything with beacons, which means that the consumer's smartphone or tablet must have the app installed, which can leverage the presence of that beacon or can detect the presence of that beacon to do something. It is not possible to do anything with the consumer's smartphone without an app actually being present on it. The beacon is, as I described already, merely a radio transmitter. It can't trigger any kind of specific behavior in the app. Of course, there are a few things that iOS will let you do, like show a coupon in the Passbook app, but that's really very specific to iOS. But that's really what you need to do, is get yourself an app or use your app that you've developed for your business and use it in conjunction with beacons to deliver a superior experience. Now, iOS and Android both support beacons and Bluetooth Low Energy Protocol, just in case you're wondering, and it is also supported, as a matter of fact, by Windows phones, at least at the OS level. But there are still some missing pieces in terms of being able to write applications that take advantage of that on Windows devices. So that's still a work in progress. As of today, it's really just iOS and Android. On iOS, a beacon-enabled app will work on any iOS version 7.1 and above. And what's interesting about the way iOS does it is that an app can look for beacons even if it isn't running. That is, even if it hasn't been launched and available in the background. Android, which supports Bluetooth Low Energy from version 4.3 onwards, that's Jelly Bean, requires that as an app developer you write a separate service that runs in the background. Now this is a rather in-depth technical detail, but I thought I would share this with you because it is something that you must keep in mind if you are figuring out how you want to roll out your beacons and how you want to engage consumers. You do want to consider the fact that on iOS, today at least, it's a lot simpler than it is on Android, but it's still possible. So moving on to use cases, right? I mentioned that we have clients, we have inquiries coming in from all kinds of different verticals, so retail, museums, hotels, and a few others. I'll just go over a few of those very quickly. What we're seeing, which is very interesting, is retailers using beacons to send contextually relevant offers, promotions, use actual behavior in store, use the data gathered from that to actually push a notification and push some kind of engagement. We've also found that retailers are using it to enable contactless payments. So you don't have to pull out your credit card, your smartphone does the authentication, and you just pay without even coming close to a checkout counter. That's what retailers are doing. Museums, on the other hand, are using beacons to enhance the museum experience and the way you actually engage with exhibits. So they're doing what they like to call exhibit-aware content. So let's say you walk in front of an exhibit and you wait there for a couple of seconds. The smartphone app on your device will know that you're standing in front of a specific exhibit, will know which exhibit, and will automatically show you all the content that is specific to that exhibit. It could be multimedia content like videos, it could be a bunch of audio clips, it could even be image slideshows. That's the way museums are using beacons. Hotels, they're doing very interesting things. They're enabling check-in using beacons. So you walk into a lobby and your smartphone says, hey, you're checked in, head to room number 1305, things like that. Keyless entry into rooms and even enable indoor navigation inside a hotel. They're using beacons to even enhance in-room controls and even the whole in-room service experience. Events, that's another interesting area that we're seeing a lot of beacon inquiries coming in from and beacon deployments. Events want to enable frictionless registration on site. They want to improve the way attendees network with each other. There have been a number of good use case studies on how events have been using it. You can learn a lot more about that and other industries on our Beaconstac blog, which is blog.beaconstac.com. And we also have industries like aviation. So airports are using beacons. I'm sure many of you who attend on the webinar today have heard of Dallas-Fort Worth and the beacons that are being piloted there by American Airlines, using it to provide flight information, guiding passengers to their gates, and providing basically navigation, access to retail, access to all the different services that an airport provides. And lastly, theme parks as well have been, and entertainment venues in general, have been using beacons to provide entertainment, for instance, while waiting in line, guiding visitors to the venue, enabling similar content delivered experiences, audio, video content, etc. So we're really seeing a very wide variety of use cases across different verticals. Now, moving on to what we believe are some of the challenges you will face when you deploy beacons in the real world. Over the next couple of slides, I'm going to talk to you about installation of beacons. I'm going to talk to you about tracking, monitoring, and managing your fleet, and security aspects. What is it that you need to think about? How do you set security requirements for your beacons, things like that. And we're also going to talk to you about, once you actually have beacons and you have apps, how is it that you can do proximity marketing and use that information that is gathered for any kind of analytics that you may want to gather from your physical space. So I'll go over all these details over the next couple of slides. We'll start with talking about beacon deployment or installation. Now, the first thing that one must keep in mind is typically the numbers involved are actually not insignificant. So in many cases, you may be installing maybe a couple of hundred beacons, 100 or 200 beacons, and we've seen installations where there are over 1,500 to 1,000 beacons. Of course, they may be spread out over various locations, but there are still a large number of beacons. Now, in a given physical space, when you decide that you need to install beacons, you have to consider the fact that beacons are, in the end, radio devices and are susceptible to interference from other devices and other radio transmitters. That could be Wi-Fi, it could be all kinds of everyday devices, and there are all kinds of devices these days that are transmitting on different wireless bands. So one thing to check for is when you actually place beacons in a physical location, you need tools that help you calibrate receive signal strength in different parts of a given layout. You need to make sure your beacon signal is actually at the proper level at a given location. Let's say you have a shelf or a rack and you place a beacon at a given location and it's servicing 2 or 3 different racks. If the signal strength is not proper because of interference or what have you, you're not going to get the desired results. So it is important for you to use a proper tool or a calibration app which optimizes placement. Now, it's also important since it's very likely that you're installing multiple beacons in a given space. You actually have to also think about zone overlap, and I'll explain what that means. A given beacon, and actually if you look at the diagram, you'll see that a beacon has a zone of influence, which is determined really based on signal strength of the transmitter, what it's set to, and of course the interval and things like that. Now, in many cases, you will find that at a given spot, you're actually receiving signal, and sometimes very strong signals, from multiple beacons at the same time. Now, this becomes a problem because your app now, all of a sudden, will start pushing messages from 5 different beacons. It may actually confuse the user completely, and it is really quite a suboptimal experience because it's not something that is easy to handle. So there are 2 ways of attacking this. The first thing to do is when you're actually placing beacons, you want to reduce zone overlap. You want to reduce zone overlap by having an app or a tool which allows you to measure received signal strength in different locations, and then is able to help you gauge when something is close enough and which beacons are further away so that they don't interfere with the signal. So those are some of the things that you need to do to reduce zone overlap and optimize beacon placement. Another thing that becomes important when you're doing beacon installations is to plan your procurement. Now, it's very likely if you have a fairly large installation that you have requirements that vary across different parts of the space. It is possible that you have beacons, you need beacons in a given space that don't have any batteries in them, that can rely merely on USB power. So that's one kind of beacon. In some cases, you may have the requirement of placing beacons outdoors, which means that they can be exposed to the elements, and so you may need waterproof casing, you may need a bunch of things that make your beacons weatherproof. In some other cases, you may have that the beacon needs to be deployed in a light fixture or some other source which requires you to plan what kind of beacons you need. In many cases, you end up going to different beacon manufacturers and procuring different sets of beacons based on what the physical space actually needs. So that's something to keep in mind, and we recommend that you talk to different beacon manufacturers based on your requirements and plan ahead and place orders, especially if you have large numbers, because it takes a while for them to produce the order or the size of order that you may have in mind. Moving on to beacon fleet management, which is really something that you will be concerned with once you actually have your beacons out there in the field. So let's say you are a national retail chain spread out across 25 cities in the US, and you have maybe something like 500 beacons deployed across these 25 locations. Beacon fleet management refers to how in a software interface or in a user interface somewhere or a dashboard, you can keep track of your beacons. You can figure out where they are in the world, what their GPS coordinates are, what what kinds of tags, what kind of data is being associated with them, um, whether their battery levels are okay, when they were last seen by a smartphone, all of this information, which is tracking data coming from multiple beacons in the field and monitoring these beacons. This is all part of fleet management, right? And this is something which becomes pretty significant once you have beacons deployed at various locations, and once you go beyond a certain threshold. I mean, you may find it relatively straightforward if you have maybe 20 beacons or even 50 beacons, but it really becomes quite unmanageable once you go beyond that number, and all of these are real issues that you will have to deal with when you have beacons out there in the field. Now, one thing which we've seen often, and I have to tell you that we've experienced this, is that beacons actually get stolen all the time. I'm not kidding about this. It's true. Beacons, we've experienced a number of cases where at events we've found that beacons have been placed in specific locations and placed properly, detected all at the properly at the beginning of the event. And when we go and check, every single day we go and check if all the beacons are okay using the Beaconstac tools. And we found in so many cases there were at least 3 or 4 beacons lost by the end of the day. And that was something which we had not really planned for. So beacon theft is something that you have to plan for, and it's part of fleet management. Which really brings me to this whole function of fleet management. It will require you to invest in a software platform of some kind. And our recommendation is if you're going to manage your fleet, you have to consider the fact that you're going to have beacons from multiple manufacturers. You're going to have beacons of all kinds. And so you do need to really use a software platform that is beacon agnostic, that works across beacon manufacturers. So those are some of the things to consider when you are working with a beacon fleet. And yes, funnily enough, you do have to worry about theft and things like that. Moving on to security. A beacon is really a small device with a bunch of circuitry on it. In many cases, there's firmware running on it. And beacons have a bunch of settings that you can control. What the numbers are that it broadcasts, what its identification numbers are, and a bunch of other things, including hardware-specific information that you may want access to. In some cases, a beacon may actually have other sensors on it, temperature and light and whatnot. All of that data is available on the beacon, but accessing it will need to be controlled, which is really important, because if you don't have authentication, you're really going to set yourself up for a hijack, or really someone hijacking your beacons, or even just messing with them, changing their settings, modifying configuration, and essentially making them malfunction. So it's important for you to think about or procure beacons which have the ability to control access to settings through an authentication mechanism, and you also want to make sure that they support encrypted administration control. If it's very simple administration control just over the standard Bluetooth, then they're essentially opening themselves up to eavesdropping and other such attacks. And so it's important for the administration control to be encrypted. Now, there's another important part about beacons themselves, which is the software that resides inside the beacons, which we call beacon firmware. There's something there which we have to consider as well. Beacon firmware is likely to have at times bugs, and may actually require updates for it to, in many cases, fix problems that you may be experiencing with beacons, or in some cases, close a security hole. It will matter when you have 500 beacons, or even 1,000 beacons, or even 200 beacons for that matter, that you're able to update firmware on the fly when they're out there in the field. It isn't really realistic to go to every single beacon and update their firmware and essentially do that in a very manual way. So this will become pretty important, and that is something to keep in mind from a security angle. And of course, physical security is just as important. As I mentioned, is just in the previous slide. Beacons are really tiny, and so they can be just put into someone's pocket. And so it's important for you to think about what kind of hardware you'd use, where you deploy them, whether they be visible, whether they'd be hidden away in other cabinets or secure spaces. These are things that you have to plan for when you're doing a beacon deployment. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about what really happens? Let's say you have beacons out in the field, you've deployed them, they're secure, everything is good to go, and you have your app out there. Very soon, you'll find that you want to control the behavior of the app through these beacons. But how is it that you actually, how do you actually change behavior of a beacon? The fact is, you're actually changing behavior inside the app, not inside the beacon. And in many cases, you want to trigger context-specific notifications. So, for example, you may want to, let's say, only send a message to someone who is a loyal customer, not everyone. So maybe a coupon is attached to the fact that they're a loyal customer, or have a certain number of reward points. Now, as the rules that you want to set up in your application get complex, you will find that you have to move this logic outside your app. And why do you have to move this logic? It's pretty straightforward. Think about it. Are you going to release an update every single time you have a change to make in your if you have a new promotion? Are you going to update a new release for the app? You put a new version out on the App Store? Of course not. You're not going to do that. And so that's why it's important for you to plan for the messaging component and the way you deliver data through the app based on beacon notifications through a third party or even for that matter, a separate server-side software solution. This will allow you to rapidly customize beacon-enabled apps without actually pushing an update to your iOS or Android App Store every single time. Pushing updates won't work most of the time because not everyone updates when there's an update. And so that's really an unworkable solution, which is why it matters that you have a server-side solution that can push updates on the fly and allow real-time marketing and real-time proximity marketing. Another very interesting use case, and this is something we're seeing a lot of different industries do already, is they're gathering data on user behavior through beacons. They're using it to measure footfalls, visits, recency, frequency, actual behavior in the physical space, whether it's a store or a museum, and using that data to take business decisions. And so essentially what you could do is think of beacons as being able to give you the kind of analytics that Google Analytics gives you for your website. So beacons can give you Google Analytics for physical spaces. If you deploy them properly, gather all the data that you're getting, and run it through an analytics system, you can actually learn a lot about these physical spaces. And that's what's really cool about beacons. You can really instrument what's happening in the offline world. You could never do this before. And that's what makes it so exciting. So those were some of the challenges that I wanted to share with you today. I want to very quickly tell you a little bit about Beaconstac, which is Mobstac's software platform that enables businesses to deliver superior customer experiences for the use of beacons. Obviously, there are a number of things that Beaconstac does for you in terms of fleet management and some of the things that I covered today already. But what is most unique about Beaconstac's offering is that it is completely an API-driven platform with fully native iOS and Android SDKs. This allows every aspect of your beacon deployment to be controlled through APIs, either through the app or any other third-party system. We have integration that's available with CRM systems and content management systems and even e-commerce backends. So this allows you to do more complex use cases, execute scenarios which go beyond a simple push message. And Beaconstac is also a beacon agnostic software platform, which means that you can buy beacons from any hardware manufacturer and Beaconstac will work with all of them. So that is, in a nutshell, what Beaconstac offers to those of you who are interested in a software solution to go with your beacon installation. That's pretty much it. Thank you for listening. At this point, we're taking questions. So as I said, you can type the question that you have into our question window, and we'll answer as many as we can in the time we have today. And the ones that we have that are unanswered, we'll follow up with a separate blog post and cover those as well. So the first question that we have seems to be an interesting question here is NFC versus beacons. What's the difference? It's a great question. So NFC and beacons, I'll give you in a nutshell. NFC is designed for detection at a couple of centimeters, right? So NFC essentially will work only when you're looking at distances of maybe 10 centimeters, 15 centimeters, so really, really close. Beacons, on the other hand, the signal strength and the distance that you can get in terms of proximity detection, etc., is a function of the transmitter itself, and it's actually in many feet. So to give you a sense, you should be able to get a beacon that can transmit a signal about 70 feet, or for that matter, even 40, 50 feet. So it's really about the kind of distance the signal covers. So they have very different applications because of that fundamental difference. One of the questions that has also come up has been on primary beacon vendors that we work with. Now, we actually work with a number of different beacon manufacturers because, as you know, the beacon or the iBeacon protocol is a standard. So any beacon manufacturer that is compliant with that protocol will work with Beaconstac. That being said, we have had experience with working with specific hardware. So we have worked with Estimote, we worked with Contact, we worked with a bunch of different companies, and we are happy to recommend beacons that may suit your need. Radius Networks makes beacons. There are lots of companies that make beacons. So we can recommend hardware based on your needs, but we don't have a preferred vendor or anything like that because our software will work with any iBeacon compliant hardware. I hope that answers your question. So one of the questions that's come up has really been around interference, which is the question is, when shops in the mall have a Wi-Fi router for internet access, and will this internet router or will the Wi-Fi router cause interference with in-store beacons? So the short answer is you will experience some level of interference because Wi-Fi is on 2.4 gigahertz by default, and so even Bluetooth Low Energy is BLE, or Bluetooth for that matter. So one of the ways that we have actually mitigated this in real deployments is we've done two things. One is we've actually used calibration tools to see the kind of signal strength that we'd like to see at different points on a given space. And so we walk around with this calibration map that we have, and then we actually measure the signal strength that we get. When we see interference and the signal strength is lower than we perceive, we essentially tweak the interval setting as well as the signal strength setting on the beacons themselves to account for the interference that you may be seeing from other devices. So that's one thing to do. Now, a question that has come up is if you have to walk the room to get updates to the beacons, that is, if a firmware needs to be upgraded, you actually have to walk to each beacon and update the firmware. Well, the thing that we are seeing today in the market with beacon manufacturers is this depends on the beacon manufacturer's design. In some cases, you actually have to be physically within the proximity of the given beacon to update its firmware through the manufacturer's software. So yes, you would need to do that. But what we have begun to see is some beacon manufacturers are providing networking abilities in their beacons, which will allow you to independently reach the beacon outside of just the Bluetooth signal and actually update the firmware. So that's another possibility, but so far it sounds like most beacon manufacturers require you to be actually connected to the beacon to update its firmware. A question that someone has just asked is how quickly the signal is captured, and if a customer moves quickly through several zones, what will really happen? And so this is a good question. In fact, what we have seen is that there are numerous ways to tackle this. Now, iOS will give you updates every second, for example. So if you wait for iOS to tell you whenever it detects a beacon, it will give you a notification every single second. So that's like the lowest resolution. But what happens in many cases is the app, you have to build logic into the app so that when you see multiple signals, or even if you see signals repeatedly, you kind of have to ignore them, or you have to set some kind of threshold before you react to a specific signal. So if you're driving in a car, for instance, and you just fly by 5 zones, if you've not stayed long enough in a specific zone, the app would probably not trigger the logic or even detect the signal if it's less than a second, in which case you should just ignore it. The point I'm trying to make is that it's important to basically code this into the app logic so that it knows how to deal with this kind of a situation where it sees beacons very fleetingly. So these kinds of things are handled for instance, Beaconstac SDK does this for you automatically. So you can actually just leave that to the SDK and it will take care of this kind of a situation. Another question that's come up is, do you use geofences or any other methods to start listening for a beacon? This is a good question. In fact, we found that this is something which is dependent on the application. Now, there are some applications where they don't want to trigger beacon behavior outside of a certain geofence, in which case it makes sense to apply a geofence and only trigger behavior inside that geofence. It does impact battery life. I do agree with you on that. So we've done both. The way customers have used Beaconstac, because it's in the SDK, it's a configurable setting in the SDK. If you want to use a geofence, you could use it. If you don't want to, you don't have to, and so it's really up to you. But yes, we have used a geofence. So that's, I think, pretty much all we have time for today. I'm going to type up the responses to a few other questions that have come in. Unfortunately, we don't have time to get to them today, but we will make sure that we put this up on our blog and we'll have that sent out to you as well. So once again, thank you so much for dialing in. I know that it's pretty late in some parts of the world, including India and countries around the Indian Standard Time Zone. So thank you for dialing in so late. You can reach us on our Twitter handle, Beaconstac, or you can write to me personally, ravi@mobstack.com. And of course, you can come to our website at any point, or even our blog, and continue to learn more about how beacons are being deployed in the real world. Thank you again for your time. Bye.